This is a tiny, tiny nation in Southeast Asia, and they've finally passed legislation that will not just discourage homosexuality, but that will discourage it with the death penalty. At the end of World War II, when most of the fundamental assumptions governing the United Nations were created, and to some extent codified in laws, policies, charters, and what have you, at the end of World War II, there was no nation state in the world that felt it was their business or their responsibility to boss around the other nation states to get them to protect gay rights, to prevent homosexuals from being persecuted. And now, in 2019, it's a very fundamental, very important assumption that we don't know what to do with. They all just sit there with their mouths open, apoplectic, as the decades go by, and they do nothing about the fact that there are 70 nations, 70 different countries that are members of the UN, right now, make homosexuality illegal.
The Sultan is publicly enforcing harsh Islamic law, but privately he leads a life of opulence and decadence in his small, oil-rich nation.
It is a great pleasure to welcome my good friend, His Majesty the Sultan of Brunei. Our militaries that are extraordinarily capable, and the bilateral military relationship between the United States and Brunei has the capacity to help people in times of need and to try to help avoid conflict rather than start conflict.
He has, according to reports, at least 150 homes. He owns almost 20 aircraft. He has something like 7,000 to 9,000 cars, hundreds of thousands of suits, and millions of dollars in artwork.
He is a key leader in the Southeast Asian region, but also widely respected around the world.
It's hypocritical because he's talking about living humbly by the tenets of Islam, and yet he is, of course, one of the most fabulously, probably the most fabulously wealthy person on earth, and certainly the most materialistic person on earth.
My understanding is tomorrow he's going to have an opportunity to take his family up to New York, where we're going to encourage him to do some shopping because we want to continue to strengthen the U.S. economy.
The human rights paradigm raises more questions than it answers, but that makes it all the more important that we do with due diligence ask those questions and come to new conclusions, both in reference to particular controversies that may arise in the news and in reference to the changing cultural assumptions of our generation. At the end of World War II, when most of the fundamental assumptions governing the United Nations were created, and to some extent codified in laws, policies, charters, and what have you, at the end of World War II, there was no nation state in the world that felt it was their business or their responsibility to boss around the other nation states to get them to protect gay rights, to prevent homosexuals from being persecuted. And now, in 2019, it's a very fundamental, very important assumption that we don't know what to do with. It's pathetic. Politicians, celebrity activists, national governments, and United Nations agencies, they all just sit there with their mouths open, apoplectic, as the decades go by, and they do nothing about the fact that there are 70 nations, 70 different countries that are members of the UN, right now, make homosexuality illegal. And the particular example we are discussing today, the particular example that today is the most important controversy for the newspapers to talk about, and that sadly will disappear from the newspapers within 2 weeks, the important example today is the bad news from Brunei. Brunei, however you want to pronounce it, this is a tiny, tiny nation in Southeast Asia, and they've finally passed legislation that will not just discourage homosexuality, but that will discourage it with the death penalty. Homosexuality will be treated as a death penalty offense henceforth in Brunei. Now, who do you expect to do something about this? Do you expect there to be sanctions imposed by a neighboring state like Indonesia or Malaysia or the Philippines, do you think that those countries are going to impose sanctions on Brunei equivalent to the type of sanctions that are imposed against North Korea, Iran, sanctions that are imposed around the world to encourage political change, encourage policy reform, or encourage regime change, whatever the objectives of those policies may be. The types of sanctions that, of course, are taken for granted with a tiny, powerless nation like Cuba. Cuba's faced sanctions for so long, and they failed to bring about political change. But nevertheless, there's no real risk for foreign powers in demonstrating their moral superiority over a country like Brunei. And there's a certain pragmatic school of thought that says, hey, even if we wouldn't stand up on a moral and ethical issue when the powerful nation we're standing up to is Russia or China or the United States of America, even if we don't have the luxury of standing up for human rights when the risks are too great, when the consequences are too grave, that it nevertheless is important and meaningful for the United Nations and national governments around the world to take that stand, to impose negative consequences for negative policy choices when they can. To make an example out of Brunei, even if you're not going to consistently enforce this human rights standard or policy around the world equally. But nobody's even going to do that, are they? There's no whisper of a possibility that the United Nations will stand up and change the world, right? So the question we have to start to ask is, why does the United Nations even exist? When did our expectations of the United Nations get so low that we don't expect them to stand up and make a decisive difference in any conflict anywhere around the world on any human rights issue anywhere around the world? And I understand there's a great fear amongst governments that if the United Nations actually starts carrying out the human rights mandate that it was created to pursue, it's going to result in a kind of tyranny of objective standards being imposed where local, subjective, cultural standards don't match up with those objective expectations. If today you impose on a Muslim nation the expectation that they should treat homosexuals as equals, that homosexuality should be a protected, normal form of sexual behavior, well, what about circumcision? What about circumcision in Christian countries, in Jewish countries? Don't we know as a scientific fact that circumcision is an injury inflicted on a child? Don't we know that this is a barbaric religious tradition that really harms people in an objectively real way? When you take away the cultural accretions of centuries and you look at it objectively and scientifically, isn't this something that ought to be illegal to protect the rights of the child, or something that, if it is legal, you should only be allowed to do once you turn 18, once you can make the legal decision yourself to have a surgeon cut off part of your penis or cut off part of your vagina? Isn't that a kind of self-evident legal and political challenge that somebody should be responsible to referee? I'm using referee as a verb here. If not the United Nations, then who? Right? You can't expect Malaysia to scrutinize Brunei on this. You can't expect Indonesia. You can't expect the Philippines. Who's the referee here? Who's standing up to draw these lines and ask these questions and push the whole world forward toward some kind of progress, whether you define that in terms of human rights or not? I've lived through an incredibly bleak and depressing time in terms of international politics. I lived through the worldwide disappointment about humanitarian intervention in Yugoslavia, Kosovo, that whole mess. I lived through the disaster of United Nations intervention, well, the very end of it, in Cambodia. Cambodia's long story. Anyone else here old enough to remember United Nations intervention in East Timor? How about Haiti? How many United Nations interventions in Haiti, and how many went horribly wrong? Did I mention Rwanda? Rwandan massacres, Rwandan genocide? No. When I was a kid in the Bill Clinton era, there was this doctrine that was really popular in the press and amongst career politicians, and they called it R2P. So capital letter R, the number 2, and then the letter P. And they called it responsibility to protect. And it was this idea that anywhere in the world that there was a serious violation of human rights, that there were war crimes going on, that basically United Nations military, that's what we're talking about, should intervene. There was a responsibility to protect human lives. And now if that were taken seriously, every country in the world that has the death penalty for homosexuality, you should have some kind of intervention against. And if you're not going to have a military intervention, of course you should have trade sanctions. You should have some kind of at least symbolic punishment from the United Nations, whether it's economic or whether you just lower their flag. Why not have the flag at half-mast for all the countries that are fundamentally violating all these human rights all the time? Would that require so much heroism on the part of our politicians? My point is here, on the one hand, the United Nations was created with a set of expectations that really people in power would be afraid to pursue in an honest, overt, thoroughgoing manner. The human rights doctrine, none of them really want to try to rigorously enforce or even really talk about. What would human rights mean if we applied it seriously to the current situation in Ukraine? What would any of the United Nations principles mean? No, just, Syria, these are really tough conflicts, right? So it's been agreed, especially after a long series of fiascos and disasters. Again, whichever ones stand out in your mind, whether it's Rwanda, Cambodia, what happened in Yugoslavia, whatever. It's been agreed upon as a kind of silent consensus that the United Nations should do as little as possible all of the time. What hasn't been agreed upon is the budget for doing as little as possible. Currently, expenditures by the United Nations are at $50 billion per annum. That's a round number, you understand. 50 billion US dollars. $50 billion US dollars per annum. Peacekeeping operations. Those are military interventions. Don't kid yourself. Peacekeeping operations, I have approximately $8.9 billion budget. Okay, those guys don't just talk. I don't know, World Food Program, $5.3 billion. United Nations Development Program, $4.7 billion. Goes on, and adds up to over $50 billion US dollars. So are you telling me that this organization, with a budget that is so big it cannot be fathomed, and really no democratic accountability, no transparency, none, zero, completely elitist, top-down organization created to pursue the ideals of that period at the end of World War II, had the Four Freedoms doctrine from the United States, where everyone said, hey, all these terrible things that happened during World War II, never again. We're going to create this doctrine of human rights and this very well-funded agency that's going to enforce it. Are you telling me that the United Nations, with a $50 billion budget, is powerless against the tiny nation of Brunei? Population 400,000. And if they're not powerless, why is it that nobody, I looked at the New York Times coverage, I looked at Deutsche Welle, I looked at several different articles covering this. Nobody is even discussing the remote possibility that anything is going to happen. And again, if that impetus for change, if that power of suasion is not put upon Brunei by the United Nations, who do you think is going to do it? All of these people are paid more than the highest paid staff at any national agency. The United Nations was founded with that mandate. By definition, if you work in economics, within the United Nations, you will be paid more than someone in any government in the world, in the highest paid government in the world, who has a comparable position in terms of responsibilities or research. That's the way salaries are set within a nation. They were founded with this mandate that they would pay all of their staff more than any national government would pay them. People paid huge amounts of money. There is no possibility that nobody even in reporting on this, nobody even conceives of the possibility that, one, the United Nations will solve the problem, or two, that the United Nations will make some kind of decision to change the situation fundamentally. They are not risking their own reputation, their fate, their political careers are not in any way attached to the success or failure of outcomes, whether those are human rights outcomes or democratic outcomes or, I don't know, just a project to make the world a better place. There's no sense in which their career or their reputation, there's no sense in which there can be positive or negative consequences for them linked to these projects the United Nations embarks upon. And maybe that's why, again and again, the outcomes of UN projects are so underwhelming, right? They're not answerable to a public democratically. They're not even answerable to a set of objective standards like human rights that would say, hey, guess what, guys? It might be politically convenient to get along with Russia. It might be politically convenient to get along with China. It might even be politically convenient to get along with Brunei, this tiny country that just made homosexuality death penalty offense. But political convenience isn't what we're answerable to. We have this objective list of facts that define what's democracy and what's not, what's human rights and what's not, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, and then we have to enforce those standards. Then they'd be more like a law enforcement agency and less like a pseudo-democratic government with a council of people debating what policy should be, right? Our expectations of the UN have been lowered to such an unfathomable extent that we neither expect them to do anything decisive in relation to a more abstract matter of principle like gay rights in Muslim-majority countries, nor do we expect anything to change, anything decisive to happen in a situation where it's incredibly ethically simple. Children are starving, and you, the United Nations, have been handing out sacks of rice with the World Food Program logo for decades, and you haven't been achieving your goals. You failed. And sure, it's not all your fault. It's also the fault of the communist government of Laos. But who then is going to put pressure on the government of Laos to reform and change? Is it going to be Vietnam? Is it going to be Cambodia? Is it going to be communist China next door? Are they going to say, hey, we're going to put sanctions on you. We're going to put your flag at half-mast. We're going to lobby and pressure you to come into the 21st century and start living up to these human rights standards and to start doing a better job providing opportunities or even just food for your own people. No. The impetus for change, positive change, whether you call it human rights or call it something else, has to come from somewhere. I'd love it if it came from the grassroots, but the pathetic reality in 2019 is it's coming from celebrity activists like George Clooney and nowhere else. Nowhere else. No one else. There's a better chance that 2 months from now, George Clooney and his little movement for gay rights is going to be making a big difference in the world. There's a better chance of that than there's a chance of anything coming from the United Nations or any other federal international institution.